Alright, my friends, let us crush the puny, tiny Oathbreaker Knight. Though, of course, to do that properly, we're going to need to become even larger. Now that we're suitably enormous, let's go ahead and try to stun him here. Notice the 99% chance to hit. That's actually even higher. We only have a 1 in 400 chance of missing that attack. And then, now that he's stunned, let's go ahead and boot him off into space, because why not? And then we're going to throw a weapon after him. So let's go ahead and activate Elemental Cleaver. We'll choose, I don't know, lightning damage. Why not? And then we're going to throw our weapon here. And we'll throw Nirolna. Please ignore the collateral damage to do even more damage to the Oathbreaker Knight. So we have done a tremendous amount of damage, hurled him into space, stunned him. We could knock him prone or do all kinds of other crowd control effects. And of course, we can do this all to every enemy in every combat while being enormous. All right, let's get to the build. Hello, my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 character building guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today, we're covering a build I'm calling the Big Bad BONK. If you've ever wanted to turn into a giant and kick your enemies through a wall, or hurl allies, enemies, and weapons around the battlefield with impunity to devastating effect, while doing some of the highest damage output in the game, this is the build for you. This is a damaging and tanking build based around repositioning enemies so you can kick them off of cliffs into threatening effects from your allies, and also just beat them into the ground with your overwhelming damage. Before I begin, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Prechet for the extremely generous €50 donation, Jeremy Dixon for the $25, Boomstick Penguin for the $5, and Nika and JR Tomlin for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really appreciate the support so much. Alright, let's get enormous. I'm using Karlach as the example character here because this is a build about getting enormous and then stomping on people, so I feel like I would get in a lot of trouble on Tumblr if I used a different character. And perhaps less importantly, she's also the most powerful character for this build. Karlach's unique soul coin mechanic allows her to increase her damage dramatically, and because soul coins have double effectiveness on unarmed strikes, which we're going to be making a ton of, for important fights, she can empower herself enormously when using this build. So she makes the most flavorful and also the strongest way to build this character. Astarion is also very good from a mechanical standpoint because the extra damage that he gets in the late game and his extra hit chance in the early game are incredible for this character, though obviously a little bit less flavorful. And I think also this is an incredibly flavorful build for Karlach just because it embodies the type of aggressive, brawling fighting style that you expect her to have. If you're building this for a custom character, what race you pick mostly doesn't matter, though there are a couple that can give you some advantages. Wood Elf or Half Wood Elf are probably the best for the extra movement speed, very relevant to any melee character, and High Elf or High Half Elf are also very good. Even though we're going to be raging in a lot of combats and unable to use it, Booming Blade is just that powerful that for combats where we're not raging, it's absolutely worth being one of those races in order to have access to it. Other good options include Gnome or Halfling, both because their racial abilities are very powerful, and also because a giant barbarian, gnome, or halfling is very funny. Although this build is going to be taking barbarian and monk levels somewhat evenly, and we're mostly going to be prioritizing getting our monk levels earlier, at first level, we want to take a level of barbarian. The reason for this is that both rage and barbarian unarmored defense are excellent in the early game for this character. Rage obviously increases our damage just in general, and also gives us resistance to physical damage, which is going to be invaluable throughout the game. This makes us much, much harder to kill. One of the main downsides of monks, especially if you're not doing the elixir thing, is that monks tend to be somewhat squishy compared to other mainline melee characters. So having barbarian rage lets you ignore that downside completely in fights where you're likely to take hits. unarmored defense is also excellent because we're going to have higher constitution than wisdom, so this is going to let us stay unarmored, and there will be points in the game where you want to wear armor and points in the game where you want to be unarmored, depending on exactly what gear you have. So this will improve the build massively by increasing your armor class significantly. The way that this will work when you have both monk and barbarian unarmored defense is that it will take the higher of the two and use that as your armor class. So when we have higher constitution, barbarian unarmored defense will be preferred, which will increase our AC enormously. For our ability score selection, there are two different ways that we can build this character. This is a strength-based character, and just like every other strength-based character in Baldur's Gate 3, one way that you can improve the character dramatically is by taking no points in strength and instead drinking a strength elixir every single day in order to replace your strength score with a 21 or later a 27, so that you can reallocate those points elsewhere and not have to take feats to improve your strength. The other way is to not do that and just naturally take points in strength, which removes the requirement to drink an elixir every single day. The elixir build is stronger, but a lot of people don't like to drink an elixir every day, so I will show you both of them. For the elixir version of the build, you would take 8 points in strength, because you're going to replace that with the score from a strength elixir, and 16 points in dexterity, 15 points in Constitution, and 16 points in Wisdom. The odd point in Constitution is because you can increase that by 1 with Tavern Brawler later on, and obviously we're going to be taking that. Our last two ability score points, you can either put into Intelligence or Charisma, whichever you prefer, or you can even put them in Dexterity if you plan to give Ethel's hair to this character and increase your Dexterity to 18 if you want to invest all of the attribute resources into one character. But Intelligence will generally be the strongest if you're not using Ethel's hair, because it will increase your saving throw, and there are some enemies that target your intelligence with saving throws. If you are using the non-elixir version of the character, then you're going to take 17 starting strength, again because we're going to boost that with Tavern Brawler, and then we will take 16 points in dexterity to increase our initiative and armor class, 14 in constitution, also for hit points and armor class, but you still prefer the initiative, so you want higher dexterity than constitution, and then 10 points in wisdom. This version of the build will be a little bit weaker in terms of absolute power level than the elixir version, but removes the requirement to drink an elixir every day, so it's the version I'm going to show you for this character demo, but I'll talk about both as we go through. Finally, for our skill selection, the only really important thing is that you make sure you have athletics. Obviously, if you're playing Karlach, she comes with it by default, but if you're playing a custom character, you need to make sure you have athletics because we'll have abilities based on it, and it's going to be very important to shove enemies around using our athletics. Perception, because we're a barbarian, is also very nice. It's just a skill that you can have that's relevant, and taking intimidation can be pretty useful for a barbarian, even with a charisma penalty. Barbarians have a lot of unique dialogues throughout the game that are barbarian only, which sometimes have intimidation skill checks associated with them. The save DCs on those intimidates are set very low, so as a barbarian, even with negative charisma, you can often pass them and succeed in dialogue, especially with Karlach, who has thaumaturgy for advantage by virtue of being a Zariel tiefling. That's all the decisions that we have to make at level 1. Let's move on to level 2. At character level 2, we're immediately multiclassing out of Barbarian to take a level of Monk. This gives us Flurry of Blows, which lets us make 2 attacks as a bonus action, and also the Martial Arts bonus unarmed strike, so we can always make an additional unarmed strike as a bonus action. Since our unarmed strikes hit pretty hard, this is basically giving us 3 attacks per turn at level 2, or 2 attacks per turn when we're not spending resources. And in fights that are going to go longer, we can rage and increase the damage of these attacks and our survivability enormously. 1 level of Barbarian and 1 level of Monk is one of the strongest possible characters that you can have at 2nd level, because all of these abilities stack together in order to make your character extremely strong. So even in the early game, this is going to be face-rolling honor mode. We just do more attacks and thus more damage than pretty much any other character. At character level 3, we're going to take our 2nd level of Monk, which gives us a bunch of things. So firstly, we get unarmored movement. This is obviously a very powerful ability. 10 feet of extra movement speed is excellent for any melee character, especially in the early game where mobility can often be a little bit harder. It works very well with your high strength to give you lots of jump distance, so you can really move around the battlefield. At this point, also, this is the first thing that actually wants you to stay unarmored. As a barbarian at level 1 and 2, you can wear armor and a shield. So you do have a choice to make. You can have this character have higher AC using, for example, a breastplate or Lae'zel's starting armor and a shield, and that will make the character tankier. Or you can make them a little bit faster by going with full unarmored. You will have, instead of the 19 AC that you would have with the breastplate and shield combo, you will only have 15 AC, but you'll be significantly faster and more able to get to enemies. You can also swap your gear depending on the fight, whether you need more mobility or more armor class, so don't be afraid to put on armor on this character, even though we have the unarmored abilities. Nextly, we also get the 3 monk level 2 bonus action abilities, which let us spend a key point to do a bunch of things. Patient defense can give enemy attacks disadvantage, which is useful in some scenarios. This ability won't come up that often, but if you're isolated and surrounded by enemies, you can use patient defense in order to stay alive for an extra turn so your allies can get to you. Step of the Wind Dash is incredible, giving you additional movement speed, and jump no longer requires a bonus action, so you can jump multiple times, giving you a tremendous amount of additional distance, letting you move at light speed across the battlefield. And Step of the Wind Disengage, less important for a barbarian. Most of the time you'd rather just take the opportunity attack if you have to reposition, but it's still a useful tool to have. Mostly just between unarmored movement and Step of the Wind Dash and just having high strength and being tanky, you gain an enormous amount of mobility, so you can always be where you want to be on the battlefield. At character level 4, we're going to take our 3rd level of Monk, allowing us to choose our Monk subclass. Now, you can actually do this build with any of the 4 Monk subclasses, and it will still be very strong. So I encourage you to choose a Monk subclass based on what you want to accomplish with this character. Way of the 4 Elements Monk gets the Fangs of the Fire Snake punches, and the fire punches are very flavorful for Karlach and also just very cool. Drunken Master Monk gives you the ability to get drunk and run around. It's not as powerful as the other Monk subclasses, but is also very funny for a character that's intending to just get enormous and stomp on things. And Shadow Monk lets you have a couple trickier abilities and a lot more mobility, so it gives you a lot of extra tools as well. Way of the Open Hand Monk is of course the most powerful, and also lets you punt enemies around the battlefield even more, with Flurry of Blows, Topple, Stagger, and Push, so you can kick enemies off of cliffs with Flurry of Blows Push, knock them to the ground with Flurry of Blows Topple, or stagger them, preventing them from reacting, which is basically the same as a disengage. So these 3 abilities give you a tremendous amount of control over enemy actions, as well as a bunch more damage. Open Hand Monk is the most powerful one, so that's the one that we're going to use for this build guide, but any of the 4 Monk subclasses can work well in this build, so if you have a character concept that you are interested in pursuing, don't hesitate to do so. At character level 5, with our 4th level of Monk, we get to pick up our first feat, and of course, as a character that is making unarmed strikes and throwing stuff around the place, there's only one feat that we can take: Tavern Brawler. Tavern Brawler is probably the single most powerful feat in Baldur's Gate 3, because it breaks the normal rules. It lets you add your strength modifier twice to the damage and attack rolls on unarmed strikes and thrown weapons, meaning that your weapon attacks and unarmed strikes become just too hard to miss. Enemies don't have armor classes that are high enough to deal with this out of the normal power scale feature, so you increase your damage tremendously and also stop missing attacks when you take Tavern Brawler. This is obviously part of some of the most powerful builds in the game, but this build in particular uses it well because we are both making unarmed strikes and throwing objects and weapons at enemies, because Giant Barbarian is based around throwing attacks. So we can use it at range, we can use it in melee, we can use it when kicking enemies around the battlefield. So we're going to be getting an enormous amount of usage out of this incredibly powerful feat. When you see a feature that's this strong, one of the things you should try to do is figure out how you can use it even more than other builds do, and this build uses it in every possible way. For the extra point of stats that we get, obviously for this version of the build, we're going to be taking our strength to 18 in order to add our +4 strength modifier to Tavern Brawler twice over. If we are the elixir version of the build and thus just have 20 strength already and took 15 in constitution, we'll use that to raise our constitution to 16, getting us more hit points and armor class. At character level 6, of course, we're taking our 5th level of Monk to get extra attack. Now, extra attack obviously is a ludicrously powerful tool, especially for a character whose attacks are just this good. This takes us up to 4 attacks on any given round of combat, where we make 2 main hand attacks and then 2 offhand attacks. It also lets us throw things twice in one turn, so as our throwing damage becomes higher, we will be able to use that even more often. As a monk, we also get Stunning Strike, and the Stunning Strike is the best crowd control in the game. It's basically free because you have so many key points as a monk, and you're short resting frequently to regenerate these as well. It only costs you an attack to use, so you can try it multiple times per turn if enemies resist it, and it lets you more or less just not have to deal with most boss fights at all, because they'll either be stunned or just dead because of the incredible accuracy and power level of your damage and attacks. At character level 7, we have a choice to make. We could take our 2nd level of Barbarian or our 6th level of Monk, and either of those carry significant advantages. However, for this build, I think you want to get your 6th level of Monk as quickly as possible, because it gives you Wholeness of Body. With Wholeness of Body, you get an extra bonus action once per day, and this build is incredibly bonus action hungry. We need a bonus action to enter our rage, we need a bonus action to use Flurry of Blows, we'll need a bonus action to use Boot of the Giants later on. So having an extra bonus action for 3 turns once per day is incredibly powerful for this character. It also, of course, increases the damage of our unarmed strikes by a d4, which, when multiplied over every unarmed strike that we are doing for the entirety of forever, which is tons, obviously, is an incredible amount of additional damage. It's even better if you're going for the Strength Elixir version of the build, because then you'll have 16 Wisdom, so this will do an extra d4 plus your Wisdom of damage on every attack, which, with the Strength Elixir version of the build, is going to be even more additional damage. So, for both versions of the build, getting the 6th level of Monk gives you both extra flexibility with Wholeness of Body, ton of extra damage with the manifestations, more movement speed if you're unarmored, which is also extremely useful. So I think it is too important to get this level to delay it any further. Having gotten everything that we need from Monk, though, at our next level, we're going to go back to taking levels of Barbarian. This gets us extra hit points. By the way, one of the other reasons to take Barbarian at first level is that you get more hit points by taking Barbarian at level 1. It's only a couple, but every little bit counts for any melee build, and a build that will often want to be taking attacks, especially because now we have Reckless Attack. Reckless Attack gives us advantage on our attack rolls, which we won't need that often because Tavern Brawler's accuracy bonus means we just won't be missing attacks most of the time. But this can turn a 1 in 20 miss, only with a natural 1, to a 1 in 400 miss if you have advantage on that attack. So for important attacks, it's incredibly nice. It also lets you redirect enemy aggro. Enemies in Baldur's Gate 3 choose who to attack based on how likely they are to hit. So by giving them advantage on attacks, you can cause them to target this character, who has resistance to physical damage and a lot of hit points and will generally be pretty tough. So you can use this both offensively and to defend your allies by making enemies more likely to target this character. So Reckless Attack, super powerful and very important ability, especially for any character that wants to be tanking. At character level 9, we're taking our 3rd level of Barbarian, and we've already talked about the subclass that we're going to take, the Giant Barbarian. This lets us increase our size and also double our rage damage on thrown attacks. So anytime we throw something, and we're a Tavern Brawler character, so our ranged attacks are generally going to be throws, and we will want to carry throwing weapons that we can use to deal extra damage with thrown weapon attacks. We'll be doing additional damage as well. So Giant's Rage is awesome for this character. We also get increased carrying capacity, so you can carry more stuff to throw at enemies, barrels, and so on. This character makes an excellent barrel mancer as well, because you're really good at hauling them around and throwing them, so if you need a little bit of extra explosive oomph for a difficult boss fight, this is a great character to have around. We don't get like a huge advantage from Giant's Rage right away, but the additional damage on thrown weapon attacks is very useful for any Tavern Brawler character, so we're still going to make great use of this rage. Thaumaturgy is redundant with Thaumaturgy that Karlach gets, but if you are playing a different character, a different race, then the Thaumaturgy cantrip can still be nice for some of those Barbarian dialogue checks that we talked about earlier. At character level 10, we're taking our 4th level of Barbarian, and we get another feat. For this version of the build, obviously we need to increase our strength. When you're playing a Tavern Brawler character, you get twice as much value from strength. You want your strength to be as high as possible. So the only feasible choice is to boost our strength up to 20. Even if you're using story events to boost your strength up further, you still want as much strength as you can possibly get. So increasing your strength is mandatory. If you are the elixir version of the character, and thus don't need to increase your strength, there are a couple other options. At this point in the game, you'll have 16s in Dexterity, Constitution, and Wisdom. You could buff any one of those up. Dexterity for higher initiative, or Wisdom for more damage on your weapon attacks, and both of those will increase your armor class. Constitution for more armor class as well as more hit points, because whichever one you increase will become your highest number, so it'll be used for your unarmored defense. But, of course, if you are the elixir version of the build, the best feat by far is going to be Alert. Alert is just so good for honor mode, and any character can make use of that. Going first means that enemies won't get to go second because they'll be dead or stunned or knocked off a cliff before their turn possibly comes around. So the elixir version of the character wants Alert, the non-elixir version wants to increase their strength. At level 11, we're taking our 5th level of Barbarian, which gets us additional fast movement. Barbarian and Monk fast movement does stack, so we now have 25 feet of additional movement speed, which is really good, almost doubling your base movement speed, letting you just traverse the battlefield with tremendous amounts of impunity. And we get Boot of the Giants. Boot of the Giants is awesome. This is a bonus action attack that will use your athletics to kick enemies away, and because it counts as an unarmed strike, it also applies our Tavern Brawler damage, so we can hurl enemies all over the place. It will allow us to kick enemies up to double the weight that we could normally shove, and with 20 strength, that's a huge amount of enemies that we open up to being able to be kicked around the battlefield. So Boot of the Giants as a bonus action with no resource cost at all can be used in place of the Flurry of Blows push in order to not spend key points and still kick enemies around. It also is much more likely to push the enemies because it uses our athletics for the chances instead of enemies having to make a saving throw. So if you really just need to kick somebody off a cliff, Boot of the Giants will almost always get the job done. The extra attack doesn't stack, of course, but these other two abilities are still great at Barbarian level 5. And finally, at character level 12, we're taking our 6th level of Barbarian. We get an extra Rage, which is very useful. This character wants to use Rage in a lot of fights, so an extra Rage charge just gives us much more longevity. And Elemental Cleaver. Elemental Cleaver lets us, as a free action while raging, enchant our weapon with elemental damage, whichever one we choose, and it does an extra d6 of that damage when thrown, and gains the throwing and returning properties. So our thrown weapons will now deal their full damage, regardless of whether they could normally be thrown, and come back to your hand after you throw them when you use Elemental Cleaver. This is tremendously powerful with some of the most powerful throwing weapons in the game, and gives us incredible ranged damage to go with our incredible melee damage. In the late game in Baldur's Gate, melee characters, even really mobile ones like this, can sometimes fall off because there's a couple encounters where it can be pretty challenging to get up close to enemies thanks to the terrain, to hazards on the ground, thanks to various things that are about those encounters. So just having a ranged attack that's this powerful is incredibly useful for a melee character, while of course we're not giving up any of our absurd melee damage, since they both key off of Tavern Brawler, which just breaks the game in half, so you can use it either for thrown weapons or for melee weapons, and of course for throwing enemies at each other and everything like that as well. So this character can get enormous, stomp enemies flat, chuck them at each other, hurl spears or great swords, and generally just bulldoze through the game, having a phenomenal time. Alright, my friends, that's the build, but of course we can make it much stronger using appropriate items, so let's talk about those. For items for this character, one of the great things about it is that you really don't need any specific items, so you can pretty much fit it into any honor mode party, and it will usually not compete for items with any other character. There's one particular type of item that we do need, and that is initiative boosts, but outside of that, we can fight completely naked and be extremely effective, just throwing random crap that we find on the ground and punching our enemies. So we really don't need specific items. Of course, there are items that will make us stronger, so I'll talk about those, but it's important to remember that you can play this character in any party and you won't really compete for items with your party members. So firstly, of course, we need increases to our initiative, especially if you are the non-elixir version of the build. We only have a +3 by default. So an item like the Hill Rider longbow is a must for this character. That's the highest priority, is boosting your initiative. This will just passively increase it, so it costs you a slot that you're not using anyways, and is incredibly important. Going first is so important in honor mode. I would not recommend playing this character without increases to initiative from your gear. Other than that, you have lots and lots of options. We can play unarmored, and in the early game, the Graceful Cloth is probably the best choice for an unarmored piece of gear. Like I said, initiative is great. This increases our initiative and our armor class by boosting our dexterity, so an incredible choice for the character. Later on, the Bone Spike Garb will make us significantly tankier. 15 temp HP anytime we rage is a lot of extra HP, and against physical damage, that's effectively doubled, because we take half of physical damage, so those 15 temp HP will absorb 30 incoming points of physical damage. It also reduces damage by 2 per instance, so it will make us a lot tankier. A more offensive choice is the Vest of Soul Rejuvenation. This will give us more armor class and also let us make reaction attacks when enemies miss attacks against us. That won't happen that often because our AC won't be that high, but it does still increase your damage output, so it's a pretty useful tool if another character needs the Bone Spike Garb, though I like the Bone Spike Garb on this character, so that's what I would recommend. Boosts to our initiative again, and attack rolls from the Mask of Soul Perception are excellent, so this is probably the best helmet for the character by far. We don't really need the attack roll boost, because Tavern Brawler is that broken, but you certainly will never say no to hitting even more of your attacks, and +2 to your initiative is critically important, so the Mask of Soul Perception is excellent. For our gloves, we can go with anything that increases our damage. The Helldust gloves obviously are awesome. They boost both our weapon damage and our unarmed strike damage, and add bleeding as well, reducing enemy con saves. We do make enemies make constitution saves, not infrequently, so the bleeding from the Helldust gloves will make them worse at passing those. Or the gloves of soul catching. These give you more constitution, which increases your hit points and AC, and also, of course, will allow you to do way more damage per unarmed strike, so an excellent late game option. We also want a weapon, because we're going to be throwing a weapon, so we want ideally a throwing weapon, or a weapon that has an effect when thrown, like the Lightning Jabber or Nirolna. These are awesome options. In Baldur's Gate 3, even though we have Elemental Cleaver, which can give a weapon the thrown property, most weapons don't apply their magical effects when you throw them. So you still want a weapon that has an effect when thrown, like the Lightning Jabber or Nyrolna. On lower difficulty settings, on Tactician or below, the Lightning Jabber will do more damage. It's pretty buggy, so it will apply your Tavern Brawler damage multiple times, and a bunch of other damage riders will get applied multiple times with the Lightning Jabber on lower difficulties, so I'd recommend using that. And on higher difficulties, Nyrolna or the Dwarven Thrower will be your go-to. Another item I really like, or weapon I really like for this character, is the Intransigent Warhammer. This is just a really nice one for actually attacking with, because it has a prone effect whenever you kill a target or land a critical hit, which is just awesome for this character. So the Intransigent Warhammer Impulse Blast ability will work extremely well. You can mix it with Unarmed Strikes and then get the Impulse Blast for free crowd control, and that will work very well with the Intransigent Warhammer. For Amulet, there's, I think, only one choice that really boosts the character. Otherwise, you can just take pretty much anything, like the Amulet of Misty Step or whatever you might want. But the Amulet of Greater Health is by far the most powerful choice for this character. Boosting your Constitution also increases your armor class when unarmored, and your hit points and everything, so is awesome for this character. For boots, the Bone Spike boots are really fun. They give you extra AC when unarmored, and Brutal Leap is a fun action that can knock enemies prone. It's a strength save, so it will let you use a bonus action to jump and get on top of squishy mages, knocking them prone. And the Boots of Uninhibited Kushigo are the most powerful choice for the Elixir version of the build, because you'll have higher wisdom, which will increase your unarmed strike damage. But again, boots is a slot where you can just use whatever you really feel like, because this character is so not item dependent that you can get away with using some of the more fun items that you might have been itching to try out. We also, of course, can play armored. We don't have to play unarmored throughout the game, and there's a lot of items that work extremely well if you are unarmored. I know I've talked about this item a lot lately, but one that's awesome for us is the Helmet of Grit. We have bonus action attacks, both from Boot of the Giants and from Flurry of Blows and our natural monk attacks, and we need to rage at the beginning of combat, so we're desperate for more bonus actions. Wholeness of Body gives us one extra bonus action, because you get that for 3 turns when you activate it, but the Helmet of Grit, when you're at 50% HP or lower, will give you an extra bonus action all day, which lets this character increase your damage output and utility immensely. It also means enemies are more likely to target you, which can be pretty useful, but it's light armor, so it turns off your unarmored abilities. You'll move slower, because you won't get the monk unarmored ability, and you'll want to pair it with a set of actual armor, since you won't be getting the unarmored bonus from your armor class, for your armor class. Good armors are just any medium armor. The Armor of Agility is really nice, just gives you very high AC, and you can also use a shield. When you're using the Helmet of Grit and an actual piece of armor, there's no reason not to have a shield equipped. It does not stop you from having a weapon and shield equipped, does not stop you from making unarmed attacks, so you can still just make unarmed attacks even while armed, and then you can benefit from having quite high armor class and also being the damage out, having all of the damage output that we've already discussed. Having low hit points from the Helmet of Grit too, if you reduce your HP to half before combat, will mean enemies target you more often, which is great. Finally, there's a lot of consumables that are amazing for this character. Obviously, if you're doing the Strength Elixir build, you need Strength Elixirs, otherwise the build doesn't function because it's based off your strength, so you're going to want Elixirs of Hill and then later Cloud Giant Strength. Elixirs of Vigilance can be useful for the non-Strength Elixir version of the build, because bonuses to initiative are incredible, and Elixirs of the Colossus are also worth mentioning because the increase to your size stacks with the increase to your size from being a giant barbarian and raging. So while these only increase your weapon and not unarmed damage, and aren't really that good from a mechanical perspective, they're very funny because you get to be just absolutely gigantic. If you're using the lightning jabber as a thrown weapon, another thing that's very much worth carrying is just bottles of water. You can throw these for very good damage because they get all of your tavern brawler damage and everything. And so they benefit from a lot of your choices. And when enemies are wet, they take double damage from cold and lightning. So if you infuse the lightning jabber with cold or lightning damage and then throw it at enemies, they'll take double damage both from the elemental cleaver attack and the lightning jabber attack. On lower difficulty settings, they will take quadruple damage because both of those will apply the other set of damage output as well, thanks to the damage rider source bugs. So you can get wildly more damage than you're supposed to, but even on honor mode, that's still a lot of extra damage by throwing a bottle of water and doubling all your lightning damage. Finally, soul coins are incredible for this character if you are playing Karlach, because when you have used a soul coin, you increase your unarmed strike damage by 2d4, regardless of whether you're raging or not. So that gives you an enormous increase to your damage output, and it also does apply to thrown weapons when raging, so you can get a huge amount of extra bonus damage with soul coins. They're basically an elixir, but you can use them at the same time as an elixir to double elixir and get an enormous amount of additional damage. Other than that, honestly, just have fun with your itemization for this character. You have all of the tools that you need stark naked, so you don't really need specific items. So I highly recommend using items that you wouldn't use in normal playthroughs, that you've always wanted to try out but couldn't find a good place for. Just anything that you think is going to be really fun, stick it on this character, and just go nuts. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this look at the big bad BONK, and I hope you enjoy stomping your enemies into the dirt while being a gigantic barbarian. And of course, if you have enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a comment and hit like. Helps me out a ton with the algorithm, so I appreciate you taking the time to do that. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 build guides and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, folks. I'll catch you next time.